to say a couple of words to, first of all, welcome you all here to this important meeting, because there aren't many places where this discussion is taking place. And after the tragedy of 129 people being killed in Paris, which was extremely, when you look at the range of the people killed, a really tragic event, where all sorts of different nationalities and so on were affected. However, this has become an occasion for governments across the world to put their particular interpretation on it. Tonight, or this afternoon, in the British Parliament, it is being used as an excuse already to convince the British members of Parliament to support the bombing of Syria. Equally, we are made completely unaware of the many thousands of people who have been killed elsewhere in the world. And equally, our own government has indicated that it will simply follow whatever it's asked to do, either by the UN or by France. So we have a situation where an event has turned, a tragic event, has turned into a very disturbing situation, even more warlike than we are already familiar with. Now, we have three speakers here, and I think Mehmet's going to speak first, and then Claire, and then Richard. And we're going to speak for 2-3 minutes, or 4 minutes, right? Yes.
Okay.
So,
Probably 5 or 6, because Claire make it be wide.
Okay, I'll extend it.
okay, so
I
Mehmet,
was going to do that
I was just
anyway.
going to, Mehmet Finldater from the Steering Committee of the Irish Anti-War Movement. Mehmet.
Well, it's easier to get forgiveness than permission, so I was going to speak for 5 minutes anyway, so get the permission for an extent of it. Yes, I just don't want to, at great length, repeat what Marnie said, and good evening everyone, by the way, thanks for coming, about Paris. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible loss of life and terrible events that happened in Paris, right? And we all condemn it outright, no ifs, no buts, right? But at the same time, I think it's important that we also look at the wider situation across the world, and maybe remember just a few things. And I'm just going to make short points about them, and maybe let the other speakers continue, right? I'd just like to start, for example, with Iraq. I mean, daily bombing. Think of, for example, the situation in Brussels, where metro is shut down. People have been told by their workplaces not to turn up to work because of the dangers and this and that. Multiplied by 100, and extended by 14 years. Daily bombings, on top of it poverty, on top of it oppression, killings, people basically making statements to the press. Sometimes we don't know when we turn up to our workplaces or turn up to our homes, will they be still in place or not. That is the situation in Iraq, and since 2003 we're supposed to have democracy and a functioning state there. That simply didn't happen. I mean, look at Palestine. I mean, no words to better describes it in terms of the situation in Gaza, for example, than what UN says. With the current going in 2020, it won't be a place where people can live, actually, uninhabitable. 2020. Look at the daily oppression, daily killing of the people of Palestine. I mean, what would happen if a force would bomb a civilian hospital anywhere in the world? Today we heard it was a human error, the bombing of the MSF hospital in Afghanistan, where patients, doctors, activists, volunteers, all civilians have been killed. It's a human error, and we'll leave it at that. Someone just pressed the wrong button at the wrong time. And that's not the first time, that's not the first incident really, in terms of Afghanistan, right? Look at Yemen. Again, no words I think describes it better than what the UN said only just a couple of weeks ago. 80% of the Yemeni population, which are being actually under the bombardment of Saudis at the moment, sponsored by the American weapons, supported by the West, 80% of the population are facing immediate conditions, imminent conditions of famine and all sorts of things that comes with that. Now that's 80% of 20 million people, 23 million people actually. And that's UN saying that. UN doesn't necessarily always make very radical, very sort of alarming statements, but they're very specific about it. That means refugees, that means more poverty, that means more children's death, that means generations of suffering. And then come to Syria. I was doing over the last week or so for a publication, a research about the civilian deaths in Syria. And when you do that, when you actually read individual reports, individual eyewitness reports, when you look at the pictures, when you look at Amnesty International to UN to all sorts of local international agencies and their interviews, their eyewitness reports, you find it very difficult to sleep. That's the thing. As one father said, my children just evaporated in front of my eyes. He said it was as if like the air was burning. The air we are breathing was burning. That was the situation in Syria, right? 200,000 civilians dead, 15,000 estimated children, 18,000 women, and they are not being killed by a single force, but sometimes by Assad, sometimes by airstrikes, ISIS and likes, and other regional powers. And 6 to 8 million people have been displaced, and 6 million at least are actually refugees in the neighboring countries, possibly without a hope to return to their countries anytime soon. So that is the situation in Syria, and I don't think it's going to get any better. So this is the sort of wider scenery that we have been seeing. We have been sort of sometimes forgetting, sometimes remembering. But that's the problem that's the situation we are seeing, right? So the Russians are bombing on behalf of Assad. The Turks are pretending to supporting the anti-Assad forces, but actually bombing the Kurds, who are the anti-Assad fighters, anti-regime fighters, one of the most progressive fighters. We have the Jordani planes flying over, bombing all sorts of places. So it's a sort of almost like a training ground for air bombing and airstrikes. And it's not getting any better. And in the process, I don't believe ISIS is losing much of manpower. Yes, they are killing maybe some ISIS people, but it's like they identify an ISIS leader in the middle of Dublin, O'Connell Street, and they send a missile, a 2-ton missile, and they wipe the whole street. That is the sort of situation in there, right? And finally, when you look at the latest development with the Turkey shooting down the Russian warplane, first time since 1950s that ever a NATO member country came, in that sense, head-to-head with Russia, a non-NATO superpower. It shows also how the situation is so messy, so risky, and how it can actually escalate into something that is beyond just the Middle East, that is beyond just the sort of terror and horror of the Middle East that the people are experiencing, right? And that, I think, makes it a lot more important for us to deal with the issue. That, I think, makes us a lot more important for us to actually understand what our governments do, what our governments don't do, looking back to Afghanistan, coming to Iraq, looking into Yemen, Libya, Mali, and all those things over 10, 15 years. We didn't have a better world, we didn't have a safer world, we have more children dying, and in 2004 there were 35 million refugees around the world, globally. We are now facing a situation where we have 60 million refugees, and 90% of the reasons why these people are refugees are direct consequences of war and military intervention. So obviously something is going somewhere horribly, horribly wrong. And I was talking just to people in the Syrian-Kurdish border in Turkey. They are extremely worried. They are extremely afraid, because this madness of mixed mash madness of various countries for various interests is really not just affecting the people's day-to-day life, it is actually jeopardizing their future. 500,000 Syrian children in Turkey only are actually missing 4 years at this stage of education. What are we telling these children? You were born at the wrong place at the wrong time, come back another time to this world and have your education done. Is this what we're going to say? And I think in that context we need to challenge what our governments do here or what they don't do really. And one final thing I'm going to finish up with. When the Turks and the Russians were actually talking about where the plane was, who shot who actually infiltrated whose airspace, there was a big announcement made. The Turks are right because the French, Jordanian, Dutch, American and Saudi pilots have all heard the Turkish warning. I read between the lines. What the hell are all these international warplanes doing over one country called Syria? What are they bombing? Who are they bombing on whose behalf? And what are their interests in all of that? Can you imagine? 5, 6 different nations, countries, states are flying their warplanes, sometimes with each other, sometimes against each other. Turkey does deals with the Americans to bomb ISIS supposedly collectively. Americans tell the Turks it's okay for you to bomb the Kurds, and Turkey tells Americans it's okay to use my air bases to bomb ISIS supposedly. Then comes in Russia, then comes in France. It is an utter madness. It hurts people, and to look at what's going on worldwide and in the Middle East, I think we have to have a clear stand against war. I think we have to have a clear stance against the sort of racism, Islamophobia, all of this sort of atmosphere creates, because haven't we damn learned enough from 2001 and 2003? I'm going to stop at that and let the others speak.
plenty of time for questions and contributions at the end. But before I call on Glenda to speak, I'd like to pass round a sheet for you to put down your name and address and email and so on, and also a leaflet from the Irish anti-war movement as well. Our next speaker is also from the steering committee of the Irish anti-war movement, Glenda Camino. Glenda.
Okay, I've been asked to say a little bit about what's happening in America since I've been living here for about 40 years. It's somewhat secondhand, but I do have some information I'd like to share. You're probably all aware this is a very big American holiday, almost as big as Christmas. It's Thanksgiving in America. It's a time when 25 million Americans are traveling within the United States, many of them on planes. They're going to be facing police with machine guns, particularly in Los Angeles and New York, and very, very, very tight screening. And they've been led to feel a total sense of fear. They don't want soldiers on the ground, but they've been pushed and pushed by the media to support a war against Syria. Syria, as has been pointed out by Mehmet, is being bombed by everybody. It's totally chaotic. It is the most bombed country in the world. It is absolute insanity. The thing that, it seems to me that we've got the bad guys against the bad guys, and the people are caught in between. What the U.S. and Canada, the U.S. and Holland and Russia, what they have in common with ISIS is that they all believe that they can win by fear, intimidation, torture, violence, and war. And this has been proven over 15 years not to be the case. It's not going to get anyone anywhere except more enemies. Since they've discovered that it was probably a suicide bomber, the U.S. thinks now, on the Russian plane with the soda can bomb, there's a huge amount of fear because people think that it can happen to them anywhere Americans are buying guns. The U.S. governors are now rejecting Syrian refugees, and they're coming in conflict with the federal government. Mostly it's Republican governors, but some Democratic as well. And the federal government is saying you can't do that, you can't discriminate against nationality and refugees, you'll lose your refugee funding. Of course, that'd be worse for everyone. So there's a huge amount of chaos and a huge amount of trouble. And even when they've experimented in airports with sending through fake weapons and fake explosives, according to some statistics, 95% of those have actually gotten through. 95%. So at the moment, the war on ISIS was declared without any vote in Congress. There was no vote on whether to bomb Syria and Iraq, and President Obama did it anyway. And the anti-war movement, while it has been trying to get large demonstrations going, there hasn't really been any sort of national demo, as far as I know, since last year. One of the reasons is that it's been much more difficult to organize protests under Obama than it was under Bush, because Obama still has a lot of support of the Democrats and the liberals, even though it's admitted that his drone program is killing many, many people who have absolutely nothing to do with ISIS. One of the important things that's happened just in the last short time is that 4 people who actually participated in running the drone program and dropping bombs have come out as whistleblowers against the drone, the way the drones are being used, against the predators. They're all people in their 20s and 30s who've served in various reconnaissance squadrons and operation squadrons, and they've come out knowing that they can get in pretty much trouble about this, a bit like Edward Snowden. But they said they can no longer sit silently by because they know the devastating effects the drone program is having, both at home and overseas. They say that the number of drone strikes, although it's not a transparent program at all, is actually ballooned under Obama. There's more than people are at all aware of in the States. And the Pentagon has plans to increase these drone flights by 50% from 2019. They want us caught up in an endless, chaotic, horrific war. They don't care how many people are killed. They actually are aware they killed a 16-year-old U.S. citizen, and they killed his father before that. And again, they were told that he was a terrorist, they deserved to die, they were traitors. But these 4 whistleblowers have pointed out that there is a statement in the U.S. Constitution that even a traitor would deserve a fair trial in front of his peers. And when they say that they have killed enemies in action, up to 9%, according to these whistleblowers, up to 9% of the people killed in drone strikes may be unintended, and they cover it up by recording the unknown victims as enemies killed in action. So, to summarize, the anti-war movement is making an effort to reorganize. They're against bombing Syria, they're against boots on the ground. it's very difficult to know which of the very many polls that have been done are propaganda and which have any kind of legitimacy to them. In most countries, Islamic people don't support ISIS. However, if we keep on bombing Islamic people, if we continue to treat refugees as persona non grata, if we continue to abuse them, there is no doubt that ISIS will be laughing their way to victory, because they want a war between us and Islam. They want a war with the West. They want people to respond in a military way. And that's really, wins them converts, wins them followers, wins them support, or at least tolerance. One of the things that's made it difficult for the anti-war movement to organize is the sort of total control of the mass media. I think more so in, tell me when I'm talking too much, more so in the U.S. than here. There's a great deal of, it's like having cotton wool around your ears when you're in the U.S. All you hear is military leaders talking about war. You don't hear the ones who say that bombing is useless, that war and the bombing attacks are not actually doing any good. There are people saying that. There are military people with experience saying that. And they're often just not even ever, on the news. So anyway, this is a very important thing. These 4 whistleblowers have come out from this program, and they have said that we are validating ISIS. We are assisting in creating more followers. We keep the cycle going. Their children are afraid to play out in the sun because that's when the drones are coming. I think it's really important for people to make themselves as aware as possible of what's going on, to try to answer these things. We have to fight to support the refugees and asylum seekers, to make sure that they get a welcome and not abused as they're getting in France. So I think that in the U.S., there's a still sort of question up in the air as to this battle going on about accepting the Syrian refugees, and even Canada has slowed down its program of acceptance to accepting, I think, 10,000 instead of 25,000 this year. But it's very important that the U.S. anti-war movement keep going despite disillusionment, and they actually are opposing the war. They recognize that the majority of people in the United States do not believe that war is in their interest, and hopefully they can get some common action together to protest this and have a more dramatic effect than it's been in the last year or so.
Thank you, Glenda. For a view you often don't hear about from America on the drones and the degree of opposition that there might be there. Now, I'm passing around a list, partly because we're going to organise events, hopefully, around this issue, and so the list is to sign up if you're interested in any events that we're doing. Now, our next speaker is Richard Boyd Barrett, who is, sorry, now first of all, there's lots of seats up the front here if you want. Does anybody want to come up the front?
Yes,
there are 3 here, indeed. Sorry, the room isn't great, actually, is it? Is there anybody else standing? No, that's okay. So, up the front here. And just to clarify to those people who are arriving now, we have 2 more speakers, but they're on their way back from Portlaoise, so it may be that after Richard speaks, we open it up for discussion and questions, and then we'll be able to bring Mick and Claire in there. So, Richard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing that sort of, first of all, just strikes me is the sort of incredible doublethink that seems to pass for normal thinking when it comes to, sorry, you can't hear me.
A bit louder, yeah, please.
Sorry, the first thing that strikes me about the response to Paris, obviously apart from the immediate and unconditional condemnation, which I think we would all agree with, and the revulsion at the sort of attack that would happen, sort of indiscriminate, random killing of completely innocent civilians. We are all appalled at that. And we all, I think, would share the hope that we could do something to prevent horrors and atrocities happening like that again. I think that's what most normal, sensible people would feel after something so terrible happening. And so I find it then quite amazing, if that's what we would all want, I think, not to see terrible atrocities like that take place, that somehow it becomes the default normal position of governments, of the leading governments, the most powerful governments in the world, and frankly a lot of the media spokespeople, to say that somehow a rational response to this is to go and bomb other people. You know, it makes no sense, but yet it is actually presented as an entirely reasonable response. Joan Burton, in the Dáil the other day, I mean, actually, strangely, Enda Kenny had a more subtle and more nuanced response to Paris than Joan Burton. I guess not, and that's, you know, pretty extraordinary coming from Enda. But Enda Kenny didn't give any sort of succour or support, at least verbally. We'll go on to say what he is doing, which we have to oppose very strongly in terms of Irish troops. But at least he didn't in any way validate the idea that the response to Paris is to go and bomb other people in Syria. Joan Burton's almost first comment was to say it's entirely understandable that President Hollande would go and bomb Syria after what happened in Paris. And of course that's sort of echoed in a lot of the questioning and a lot of the commentary of media presenters and politicians afterwards. And think about it. How is it reasonable, after a lot of innocent people being killed, to go and kill a lot of other innocent people somewhere else? It self-evidently isn't rational, isn't normal, isn't reasonable response to something that happened. It is, to me, just self-evidently the case that you're going to compound one atrocity with another atrocity. And that you are going to increase the cycle of violence that produced the events in Paris in the first place. To me, that is just so obvious, it hardly merits discussion. And then when you look a little bit deeper into what has happened in Syria, because you might imagine that somehow France was the French state, and I want to sharply distinguish between the French state and the French people. The French people and other nationalities were mowed down by those killers in Paris, were completely innocent people, but the French state is not some innocent bystander in all of this. France has been bombing Syria for the last year. They've sent hundreds of bombing sorties into Syria, along with some of the other crew of nations that Mehmet has already referred to. And Syria is the most bombed country on the planet Earth. It has been absolutely devastated. In some of the response attacks after Friday, when they hit Raqqa, which is the capital for ISIS, or Daesh, as we should probably more properly call them. ISIS is the name they give themselves, Islamic State, claiming, if you like, to represent Muslims. Daesh is what they're actually known in most of the Muslim world, the Arab world, which is a pejorative term that most Muslims and most Arabs give to them. And it means something along the lines of inflict pain, right? So they're hated. So-called ISIS are hated in the Arab world. But in the city that they control and call their capital, Raqqa, some of the buildings that were hit in the initial responses included a hospital, a clinic, and a theatre. You know, and you think about all the absolutely legitimate and understandable and correct revulsion that concert goers were hit, absolutely, and then the French response is to go and bomb a theatre, and bomb a hospital, and bomb a clinic. And yet we don't have the same revulsion being expressed across the Western airwaves at that. And this has been going on for the last year at least, that France is involved in it. So we have to call this madness and this hypocrisy of the big powers of essentially exploiting. That's what they are doing. They are exploiting in the most cynical way the deaths of their own citizens in Paris, and using it to give support and validation and justification to something they've been doing already, but now feel they can, after Paris, they can crank it up and intensify it, adding to the utter disaster that is in Syria and destabilizing the whole region, and of course, as Mehmet has said, actually fueling the conditions which give rise to support for Daesh in the first place. And of course, you know, I mean, I've done a couple of interviews on television recently, and you mention the Iraq War, and they say, oh, come on, that's history. Forget about that. Forget about that. We're talking about now. We're talking about the situation now. And that's true. We've got to give answers to now. What do we do? Not just condemn what they're doing, but it does have to be said. And you can put it as simply as this. If the war in Iraq did not happen in 2003, there would be no Daesh. Simple. It would not be happening. The biggest refugee crisis in modern history is now taking place in Syria. What was the biggest refugee crisis that took place before that in history? It was in Iraq, after the 2003 war. Millions of people displaced from their homes. Some estimates put it at over 1 million people killed in Iraq. The state absolutely destroyed, its infrastructure utterly devastated, to the point that literally anything like you could call a state or a civilization was destroyed. And of course that was after over a decade of sanctions that had been imposed, previous, another war that had taken place before that in early 1990s, and a war that Saddam Hussein had fought against Iran prior to that. I mean, imagine that. It's just been decades long of brutality, violence, destruction, depleted uranium weapons, poisoning the water, poisoning the soil. The country absolutely devastated. And in all of that, the Western powers playing the most cynical game. Supporting Saddam when he was fighting the Iranian war, arming him, Donald Rumsfeld, arming him with the chemical weapons that he then went on and used against the Kurds. Then they install, after the war in 2003, the Maliki regime, one of the most sectarian elements in Iraqi society, who begin to whip up anti-Sunni feeling and create the sort of sectarian environment that has helped give rise to Daesh. But not satisfied with that, they were also at various times, when they were trying to counteract some Shia forces in Iraq, particularly those of Muqtada al-Sadr, when he looked as if he might overtake the American puppet, al-Maliki, then they would also back some of the most sectarian Sunni elements and arm them. And it was out of that sort of cynical manipulation of playing one group off another in order to maintain the US occupation that the forces of Daesh grow. And the hypocrisy then continues on to now. Where did Daesh get all their equipment and their money? They're one of the best armed forces in the whole conflict and best financed. They're selling oil to Turkey, right? Who is a US ally. They're selling the oil in the cities they control to Turkey, and this is, you know, this is an utter scandal that we need to find out more about. But certainly, there's pretty serious information that this is what is going on. And then, of course, you look at the role of Saudi Arabia in this, who are arming the Al-Qaeda front, the Al-Nuraza front in Syria, who've also been a party to the disintegration of Syria. So the United States, I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, and even the Irish government are in ways complicit with this, right? But think of the irony of this. Al-Qaeda, public enemy number one, Osama bin Laden, the United States and Britain and France, who are also doing a big arms deal with Saudi Arabia, are all selling arms to Saudi, engaging in normal, political, very active relations, if you like, at every level with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is then arming an Al-Qaeda outfit in Syria. And I mean, I had an amazing encounter with Simon Coveney in the Dáil one day, when there was talk as Syria began to disintegrate. I think this was about a year ago. There was a discussion about what should happen to the Irish troops who were in the buffer zone between Syria and Israel. The government were proposing that those troops should just be moved to the Israeli side of the line. And I got up to challenge Simon Coveney about this, and I said the Irish troops should just simply be taken out of there, for two reasons. One, if they go on the Israeli side of the line, then they're not peacekeepers anymore. There's an assumption in that we're now, Israel, if you like, are the safe good guys, and it's okay to be within their borders and frontiers, so they're not a neutral force anymore. So they should simply be taken out of there. But the other point I made is you're putting Irish troops in danger because some of the very dangerous militias that are operating and killing people there are operating in this area. And he said to me, oh, actually you don't need to worry because the only people active in that area are the Al-Naraza front. Now I don't think when he even said that, he knew who the Al-Naraza front were, right? But they are an Al-Qaeda affiliate, explicit Al-Qaeda affiliate. So we've gone from, you know, politicians here denouncing Al-Qaeda, which, you know, rightly, as a horrendous outfit, as absolute sectarian madmen and extremists and so on, to actually believing that the Al-Naraza front are somehow allies of Western interests and a friendly force in Syria because now the problem is ISIS and Assad, who they want to get rid of. And rightly, you know, Assad is a rotten despot who's backed up by the Russians, who's brutally assaulted his own people. Let's make that clear as well. In this, we hold the Russians just as responsible as the big Western powers for what they're doing, cynically manipulating the region and serving their own strategic interests, and willing to sanction and support and resource a vicious, vicious assault on the Syrian people, basically to serve their strategic interests in an important area, right? But the irony of it, our own minister, that suddenly the people who are public enemy number one are now sort of allies in Syria. It's extraordinary stuff. But this is the story that is repeated again and again and again of big power involvement in this region, of backing despots, sectarian forces, encouraging sectarian divide and rule tactics in order to maintain control of regions and to install leaders that will be compliant with Western interests, that will ensure the safe, if you like, extraction of oil for Western or external big power interests and companies, and regardless of the consequences for the local population. And of course, another very, very important ingredient in this whole story is the support for Israel, the ongoing support for Israel with its criminal, cruel, murderous persecution of the Palestinian people. And it's that the running sore of the injustice that has been done to the Palestinians, that continues for decades, is of course another one of the major recruiting sergeants for groups like Daesh and other extremist groups who claim, you know, they're not, but justify their activities by saying, look what the Israelis are doing to Palestine. And you can understand how ordinary people might sort of kind of get taken in by this argument when you look at the sort of vile things the Netanyahu government is saying. I mean, I don't know if people saw the Irish-Palestine Solidarity pamphlet that was produced recently, where they produced a whole list of quotes from ministers in the Netanyahu government where, among other things, they advocated genocide against the Palestinian people. They called them beasts, they called them snakes, they said it was okay to kill Arabs, it was entirely justified to destroy their homes. I mean, the language was filthy and vile. I put it to Enda Kenny one day in the Dáil, and even he had to say, yeah, that's... Now, he couldn't bring himself to say, I condemn it, but he said, it's not helpful, right? It's not helpful. But, I mean, of course, you know, if you're in the Middle East, and you're the victim of all this, if you're in Syria or in Iraq, and you hear these sort of utter, bombastic condemnation, justified, of Daesh and these people, but then when Israel does the same thing to the people in Gaza, it's just unhelpful. It's unhelpful. You know what's going on. And you think, yeah, Arab lives, Muslim lives, just aren't worth it as much. That's what's going on, and that is the subtext to all of this. And then their treatment of the refugees similarly, seeing as a sort of invading horde of animals, rather than human beings fleeing a desperate situation to which the West and the big powers have contributed in creating that situation in the first place. I'll just finish up by saying this. Against all that background, we have to challenge the war narrative. It's simple to say bombing and killing innocent people isn't a rational or sane response to what happened in Paris. But we also, I think, need to challenge what our own government are doing to try and drag us into this. And the most immediate manifestations of that are, first of all, the decision to deploy extra troops to Mali to relieve the French forces. Now, if anybody cares at all about our neutrality, what's left of it, after us facilitating 2 million US troops going through Shannon to bomb the hell out of Afghanistan and Iraq, this will further obliterate what's left of any notion of neutrality. Because although it's nominally a UN mission in Mali, the French troops have a colonial history in Mali. They're not some sort of, they're not perceived by the people of Mali as some sort of neutral force. They were a colonial power in that area. It would be like, you know, Britain being in Dublin, right, with their troops and armaments and saying we're neutral, right? People would say, no, we actually think you might be here for other reasons, right? So they're seen as, by the people of Mali as a military and colonial power pursuing its own interests, and are involved in a conflict, in a military conflict, and involved in a civil war in Mali. For Irish troops to go in and relieve French troops in that context puts us in that frame. We then become part of a colonial operation in Africa, and of course it has also explicitly been done to relieve French troops to conduct the war in Syria. And that, you know, has been said explicitly by Enda Kenny. That will be a disastrous situation, and even potentially pulls, without, I don't want to scaremonger people here about potential threats to here. You know, I think the bigger targets are obviously the main movers in this, France, Britain, the United States, but there's no doubt that the very good reputation Ireland has as a former anti-colonial, you know, a country that won its independence and freedom in an anti-colonial struggle, and the relatively good reputation Irish troops have as peacekeepers will be very, very seriously damaged if we are seen explicitly to be given support and backing to the French for their adventures in Mali and in order to assist their military assault on Syria. We will be seen as part of the external imperial colonial aggression, and that potentially makes us a target. So we absolutely should not do that. So I think we need to take that up. I'll leave that. And obviously, sorry, one very simple thing as well. You know, in order to make this situation better, stop arming the despotic regimes in the area. That's how you do it. Stop arming Saudi. Stop arming and supporting Israel. Stop arming and supporting the Maliki sectarian regime in Iraq. Stop supporting the al-Sisi regime that is butchering the democratic revolutionary movement that developed in Egypt. Stop backing these despots and arming them to the teeth. That is how you will begin to move towards some sort of stabilization in the Middle East.
We'll move to questions and contributions, and maybe bear in mind the suggestions about what we can do about this. The question of Mali, and also the UN itself has passed a resolution calling for the extermination of safe havens of ISIS. So there's lots of dimensions to the UN thing as well. And see how we can further the demands that Richard made there about stopping arming Saudi Arabia and support for Israel and so on.